Okay, here we have on the line Dr. Noam Chomsky, with whom we are going to have a dialogue about as many subjects as we can tap into the time that he's given us. So thank you so much, Dr. Chomsky, for accepting this interview for Radio Serenidad in Ecuador. I would like to start asking you directly, because of the timing, in what way does language affect a culture's vision of life and its people's behavioral tendencies?
Well, there's, of course, a mutual relationship. The way we frame and formulate and discuss things affects what we do, and the cultural conditions in which we live affect the way we use the language. It's not language that affects life, or conversely, it's the way we use language that affects it, and in fact is just part of ordinary life.
Okay, and the use of language, like for instance, I don't know if you sort of speak different languages, but it seems that a same word in a different language has a different sensory experience, and so
it requires us to frame things differently. The words tend not to be perfectly translatable into other languages, so a way in which you might say something in Spanish would have to be somewhat reformulated when you say it in English. But that's the lexical and other resources of the language will affect the way it's used in particular circumstances.
And what's the most interesting fact you have found in the history of language and its impact on human interaction?
Well, the most interesting facts about there's a lot of kind of amusing data about language and human interaction, but the real discoveries that go beyond interesting descriptions of particular things are discoveries about the fundamental nature of the system and how it evolved and how it's shaped. So, they're very basic questions about language. So how does a human infant, for example, discover the fundamental properties, the properties of the language of the society in which it lives? In fact, it starts from the very beginning. How does a newborn infant know that of all the data that surrounds it, some of it is language relevant and most isn't? That's a human-specific capacity that no other organisms presented with the same data won't get anything. None of it is differentiated from others. Why at age, say, 9 months, does an infant know the sound distinctions of its particular language and lose the capacity to hear others? So at, say, 9 months, a Japanese infant will have lost the distinction between R and L that's kept in English and Spanish and kept in different ways in English and Spanish. And then how does an infant come to have the capacities that you and I are now using? That's a very mysterious matter. There's nothing in the data alone that doesn't suffice to determine these consequences. In fact, it comes from the fundamental properties of the way our minds are constructed that picks out of data certain kinds of evidence for particular forms of rules and principles that are then applied reflexively, and determining the nature of all of this is a very rich topic which has made enormous progress in the last 50 years.
Do you think that
it wasn't even considered a puzzle?
Well, since you tapped into like the baby's way of communicating and with the parents, do you think there's a language beyond words that human consciousness or humans use to communicate, like for instance between newborns and their parents, or the intent a parent has to bring a message to the baby, or a message that the baby wants to convey to the parent? Is there a language beyond words that we use that has not been fully researched?
Well, there are ways of communicating that are not language. I mean, when a baby cries, it's communicating. When a parent hugs an infant, it's communicating. But it's just a metaphoric extension to call that language. Human language is a very highly specific phenomenon, has its own particular characteristics and its own rules and principles. It has its own genetic basis, which is quite different from other forms of interaction. In fact, language isn't really a system of communication. It can be used for communication, but if you think about it, most language use is just thought. I mean, you can't walk for a minute anywhere without thinking in language. You're constantly talking to yourself. That's reflection, planning, formulating ideas, developing thoughts, and so on. It's not communication. Communication is one of the uses of language, but it's not, in any sense, the essence of language.
In what does consciousness...
Evidence by now. Pardon?
Yeah, please go ahead. You were going to explain something?
Well, there's pretty good evidence by now that in many respects, the very design of language is harmful to communication, and it's based on principles of computational efficiency that are just inherent to the nature of the way complex systems are constructed, even if they interfere with communication.
And so, in this manner, in what way consciousness is related to language?
Our consciousness it gives us a certain superficial reflection of what's going on inside our minds. And most of the thought that's going on, including our use of language, is completely unconscious and inaccessible to consciousness. You can't sit and introspect and discover the rules of your language. They're inaccessible to consciousness, just as you can't introspect and figure out the principles that are determining that when various things in the visual field are happening, you see rigid objects. That's happening completely beyond the level of consciousness. And the same is true of the use and understanding of language. If consciousness would suffice to discover the nature of language, life would be very easy for linguists. They just have to sit and think and say, oh yeah, these are the rules I'm using. But it doesn't work like that. Studying the nature of language is like studying the nature of vision or any other capacity. It's all hidden from us. It doesn't reach the level of consciousness, and our conscious abilities only give us the very surface of what's going on inside our minds.
And therefore, what would be the highest purpose of language?
The purpose?
The highest purpose of language. Why?
Well, evolution doesn't have purposes. Things develop, and if they're and they persist and they get refined for all sorts of reasons. But it's like asking, what's the purpose of the spine? I mean, it has a lot of functions. So, for example, your spine helps you stand up instead of collapsing on the ground. It also stores calcium. It also is involved in the circulatory system, develops blood cells and so on. It does all kinds of things, but there's no sense in which it use is for expression of thought to oneself, typically, sometimes to others. It's used as an instrument of communication. It's used just to maintain social relations. So, for example, if you're, say, standing next to someone in an elevator, it may be awkward just to stand there and not notice one another, so you may start talking to them, maybe about the weather or anything. That's not real communication. That's just establishing social relations. That's a major use of language. But asking what its purpose is for any biological object is to misunderstand the way development and evolution proceed.
And so, like, I wanna sort of bridge to a point that I understand. Like, if we believe there's a relationship between evolution and how languages have developed, to the point that we are in human evolution at this moment, and the systems that we have created that come from all sorts of human interactions and thoughts. And you mentioned the relationship between thought and the language and consciousness, and we have created systems like the political system, like the religious system, the economic system, that we can see nowadays. There are systems that are trembling, and that they seem to be obsolete in one way or another. And it seems that as part of our evolution, we need to direct ourselves to create something new. And so I was wondering, what are your thoughts about what needs to happen in humanity for us to get out of the dependency of governmental controls or power structures, that we can actually evolve to the point of consciousness that we are, in one way or another, enough conscious of human interactions and the responsibility behind it to live in a more communitary world?
Yep. Well, these are all crucially important questions, but they should be separated from the question of evolution. Evolution has a very specific meaning. It means changes in the genetic structure. That's evolution. There's been essentially no evolution among humans for about 50,000 years at least. So say we're not genetically, humans or existing humans are very similar to one another, and the differences there are have to do with extremely superficial characteristics like skin color or length of hair or something like that. But in our fundamental nature, we're basically all alike, and you can see this very easily. I mean, so for example, just keep the language. If you take an infant from an Amazonian tribe which hasn't had contact with other humans for 20,000 years, and if that infant is brought up in say London, it will speak English just like every English child, and the other way around. You take a child from London, an infant from London, newborn infant, and raise it in an Amazonian tribe, it'll be just like all the other children in that tribe. What that tells us is that we basically haven't changed genetically. There's been no evolution. But there is, of course, plenty of historical and cultural change. These are developments in human society and history that make use of the capacities that a much earlier history of evolution, long gone way in the distant past, has provided us with. And now we face very concrete problems. So take, say, Ecuador. One fundamental problem it faces, and as you know better than I do, it's an area of extreme conflict, is whether to develop its hydrocarbon resources. If it doesn't develop them, it will impede the economic growth of the country. If it does develop them, it'll substantially harm the environment in which many Ecuadorians live, and it'll also contribute to long-term environmental problems. Well, that's a real conflict. How do you resolve it? Life is full of such conflicts. And we have to not evolve, but develop in ways which enable us to think through them and deal with them reasonably. And some of them are of enormous significance. So, for example, the human species right now, for the first time in its history of maybe 100,000 years or so, is now in a position where it can destroy itself. Humans have developed societies and capacities and technology which could lead to and it's not science fiction, could realistically lead to the virtual destruction of the species, at least the end of any possibility for a decent life. And there are basically two of these, and they haven't been controlled. One is nuclear weapons. There could be a major nuclear war almost any time. It's come very close in the past. In fact, we're just now coming to the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which came very close to a terminal nuclear war, which would have had devastating effects. It was avoided almost by a miracle, and things like that are happening constantly. The other is environmental crisis. We are like lemmings walking over a cliff. There's an environmental crisis developing. Some of the details are uncertain, but the general characteristics of it are pretty clear. And it's going to have very severe, it's already having effects, and in the not too distant future it'll have much more severe effects. And very little is being done to confront the problem or to overcome the risks to try to reverse what's going on. These two deep problems are kind of a dark shadow over everything that we do, and there are many others. So certainly we have to change our consciousness and understanding and the concern for one another and concern for future generations. We have to change them sufficiently so that we can confront a whole range of crises, some of them very severe, some more minor. But that's not we're not going to evolve to be able to deal with these. Evolution is a much slower process, and our entire human existence is a flick of an eye in evolutionary time.
And how do you think we can go about the changing consciousness for the mass, where we have such power structures that manipulate so much on their benefit, and to manipulate people's awareness, manipulates education? Like, for instance, at least in Ecuador, there's a huge manipulation of the government for education at all levels, including university level, and so at the same time, there's a world movement somehow that is shaking people's consciousness, but it seems to be not enough for us to sort of start waking up from this sort of hypnotic world that we have lived in, where there has always been some power structures that have ruled over the most people. And so what do you think needs to happen to shake people's consciousness in order for us to wake up and realize that we can actually learn to live in community or cooperation instead of competition, and bringing new ideas? Is it very hard to bring new changes in consciousness, or is it just a matter of time?
It's a matter of effort and engagement, and there's no secrets about this. We all know the answers. I mean, it takes educational efforts, organization, actions when they're appropriate, and it can work. In fact, it's worked in our recent lifetimes. So, for example, take rights of women, for example. I mean, 50 years ago, women were basically treated as property. Like in America, American law, U.S. law, women were essentially regarded as the property of their fathers or their husbands. Women in the United States didn't have the legal right to serve on juries until about the 1970s. And there were all sorts of forms of discrimination and oppression, most of which were just internalized, not even seen as problems. That's the way life is. So, for example, if you'd asked my grandmother if she was oppressed, she wouldn't have known what you're talking about. Of course, she was oppressed, but she wasn't aware of it. That's like saying that she breathes air. My daughters, of course, it's totally different. Well, in fact, that's changed not just in the United States, but around the world, and it's changed pretty dramatically. How did it happen? I mean, it didn't happen by taking a pill. It happened by active engagement of many dedicated people who brought about a significant change of consciousness, even of laws and of practices. There's a long way to go, but the changes have been extremely dramatic, much in this respect more so than for centuries before. And the same is true of many other things. So, for example, take, say, concern for the environment, which we were mentioning before. Now these are major issues among the general public. There's strong environmental movements and so on. 50 years ago, virtually nothing existed. Well, again, it didn't happen by magic. And the same is true of elimination of slavery. Unfortunately, not total elimination, but the efforts to overcome slavery, which have been substantially but not totally successful. The same thing. Long, hard struggle by dedicated, engaged people. And if there's any other way to bring about changes, it's been kept a secret. Mm-hmm. And these methods, they can work. They're hard. They're often painful, often dangerous. But over time, they bring about significant changes, and there's no other way to proceed.
Do you believe that the majority of people, of humans, have adapted in a very comfortable way to be led by a president or a government, instead of sort of participating more actively in or engaging in more self-sufficient ways to survive?
It's not that people accept it as right and just. It's just that the costs of doing anything different are quite high. The costs of standing up to try to expand freedom and justice are high. And therefore it takes effort and commitment and serious acts of will to undertake those such initiatives. And for most people in a position where they just too hard and too costly for them to do it. But some do, and that's what brings change. It brings changes over time. That's why we have progress in women's rights, workers' rights, concern for the environment, children's rights, animal rights, and so on. People work on these things. They're willing. Many people are willing to face the costs, and over time, often they can substantial popular movements can develop, which bring about change. I don't think it's true that people just accept the justice of subordinating yourself to leaders. It's just that working out alternatives that takes thought, effort, struggle, often harsh reactions that are harmful to the person doing it, and that's the way history proceeds. It wasn't easy to be an abolitionist either, opposing slavery.
Mm-hmm, that's right. So it seems that, at least in known history, we have lived in a very dualistic world where there's light and darkness, where there's women and men, where there's right and wrong, where there's true and false, and people in power and people completely subdued. And do you believe there's a possibility through these changes in consciousness that humanity is going through to envision a world where we can actually learn to relate one another without conflict? Or do we, where there's no wars, for instance, and we understand the value of life or of living in this planet before we actually don't have a place to live in?
It's hard to say. I mean, if you look over human history, just keep the modern human history, there are several trajectories. One of them is towards expansion of rights, expansion of freedom, greater concern for one another, for future generations, and so on. That's one tendency. There's also a tendency towards increasing threats, dangers, maybe even potentially terminal crises like those I mentioned. And the question that faces us, as always, is which of these trajectories will prevail? And that's not a matter for speculation, it's a matter for action.
Mm-hmm. And what are the tendencies? In regards of all the research that has been done, what is the tendency towards where we are headed with whatever is happening in human consciousness and all those movements with, the economic crisis, the political crisis, the value crisis in the world? Do we need actually to go through all these crises in order to awaken another level of consciousness and learn to live in harmony?
Well, we are going through crises. Those are problems of our social lives, our social structures, our political and economic structures, our personal nature, and they have to be, when the crises are of some significance, as these are, we just have to confront them and try to overcome them. So, for example, there's nothing, take any one of those you mentioned, take the current financial crisis. It's not a law of nature. It grew out of specific economic, socioeconomic arrangements which are designed by those with sufficient power to impose an organization on the world, and they don't have to remain. A lot of the crises, if you take a look at the actual causes of the crises, a lot of them have to do with particular socioeconomic decisions that were made that gave, so just to pick one of many, the financial system has grown enormously over the past 30 years. It's now a huge part of the economy. It, in fact, overwhelms much of the economy. It has some useful functions, but overall it's probably quite harmful. In fact, one of the leading financial correspondents in the world, the senior correspondent for the London Financial Times, describes the growing financial systems as like a larva that eats away at its host, the market system, the way a spider wasp destroys its host. In other words, just destroying the market system. Well, that's not a law of nature. That these financial institutions can be tamed, controlled, modified, placed under popular control, deprived of the government insurance policy that which they in fact have, that enables them to take enormous risks, and when they collapse, to run to the taxpayer for to prevent them from bankruptcy. None of these are laws of nature. These are simply socioeconomic structures and principles that have been designed by people and can be changed, just as we can change the system of production so that instead of working people being subordinated to the rule of superiors, production systems like factories or any others can be controlled and run by the workforce democratic fashion. That's all possible, but it's not going to be achieved just by saying, wouldn't it be nice? You have to work on it. Just as you had to work to overcome slavery or to gain women's rights and spend anything you can think of. It doesn't happen by itself. It happens by commitment, dedication, engagement, effort, willingness to face adversity, and just plain, long-term dedication and commitment. There's no other way.
Now, education is probably a major part of the outlook that we have on life, because obviously when we go to university, it's what it's been taught in the universities has to do with the social affairs, the human affairs in the world, and if we want to sort of change or increase our consciousness towards a more I don't call them idealistic, because I believe like living in cooperation more than competition is very possible. So maybe right now it's quite idealistic because we live in a very competitive world, yet it is very possible, and so education plays a major part of it. What do you think needs to happen in order for teachers and people in general, parents, teachers, learn how to teach children how to think instead of teaching them what to think?
What has to happen is for parents, teachers, other members of the community to get together to think through how the mode of education can be modified, and it can, so as to nurture values that we prefer to see, rather than those that are residues of old power structures that we don't want to see. Look, the struggle over education has been going on for centuries. You go back to the Enlightenment, hundreds of years ago, there were basically two competing concepts of what education should be. These questions came to the fore when the modern university system began to be developed in the late 18th century. One model, just to use the imagery of those days, one model saw teaching as a matter of pouring water into a vessel. Okay, the other model, and a leaky vessel, as we all know from experience, the other and preferred model was to regard education as a matter of the teacher laying out a string along which the student progresses in his or her own way, developing a creative initiative, the joy of discovery, going in directions that hadn't been foreseen, and so on. Those are two different modes of education. They're both quite possible. They're both used, and we can shift from one to the other with enough effort and initiative. Like anything else, these are all things that can be done, but they don't happen by themselves. They can be done if people are willing to become engaged and committed to doing them. I'm afraid I have to get off. There's another interview coming.
Oh, just want to ask, can I ask you just a final question, which is a little more personal? Is it possible? Just one more.
Yeah.
Okay. You are a very special personality in making people become aware of the truth behind so many issues, international politics, and so many issues. And you are very clear in bringing such clarity of the intentions behind, the politics and the power structures. Have you faced a lot of adversity, a lot of people against you and what you say to bring people's awareness into the light?
Oh, sure. I mean, if you take a look through history, every society has had people who just conformed to authority and doctrine, and they're usually privileged and so on. And there's always a fringe of people who question authority, question repressive structures, try to expose them, try to induce others to confront them, and they're usually punished and washed in one or another way. How they're punished depends on the nature of the society. So, say in the modern period, a dissident in, say, the old Soviet Union could be jailed, sent to the Gulag, and so on. In the same years, a dissident in U.S. domains in Latin America could very well have his head blown off by security forces armed and trained by the United States. In the Western countries, enough freedom has been won so that things like that don't usually happen, though they sometimes do. But dissidents are subjected to marginalization, vilification, denunciations, and so on. Yeah, that's what you live with if you don't simply obey power and authority.
And how has the journey been for you?
With relative privilege, it's not a serious problem.
I know. But how has the journey been for you, specifically for you?
Exactly like that. Constant, exactly what I described. I've also been in and out of jail, faced a long jail sentence and so on, but it's nothing to talk about or discuss. I mean, I'm a relatively privileged person, so these things are kind of a nuisance, but it's not like being, say, a Jesuit intellectual in El Salvador in 1989 and having security forces come in and blow your brains out.
Yeah, that's true. But still, I just want to thank you and honor you, because you are a warrior, and you give us the example that, we really have to have the willingness and not just sit and think beautiful things, but get into action. And you spread this action into the world, and that is so wonderful. So thank you very much for that, for bringing this warrior energy in, not the kind of warrior like goes and kills somebody. I don't mean that kind of warrior, but more like the strength kind of warrior. You know what I mean? And so
it's something that any of us can do
if we wish. Definitely. We need to, more of us need to do that in order to create the change. So that's why I really value what you have said, and you've been persisting in saying there has to be a willingness to do it. And I hope this message really gets to the people that have listened and tuned in today, that even though it's a holiday, there's a lot of people that have tuned in, and I'm very grateful for that, and that's because of you. So thank you so much, Professor Chomsky.
Well, thank you for having me on. Yeah, good to talk to you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.